About a month ago, I was asked by our local MPP, Matthew Ray, if I would consider making a presentation to the Ontario Standing Committee on Finance and Economic Affairs as part of their 2025 pre-budget consultations. I looked at this as a privilege, so of course I agreed to fill out the requisite request form to address the committee in my role as president of the Mapleton Chamber of Commerce. If you are familiar with such proceedings, you know that they are very structured. I was one of 3 people who were each given 7 minutes to make a presentation, which would then be followed by a time for questions from the committee for each of these 3 people for the balance of an hour. The presenters on either side of me were a director of the Grand River and St. Mary's Hospitals in Kitchener and a nurse practitioner clinic owner from London. They were each armed with very specific funding requests. I, on the other hand, had no such specific funding request, but rather a request for systemic changes that also have budget implications for the province. Here is a reenactment of the presentation I gave for your consideration and for the record. Hello, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to speak into Ontario's budget priorities. My objective today is to offer some perspective into the needs that I see in rural small-town Ontario regarding housing. You know, back in October 2022, when the government announced a goal of 1.5 million new homes by 2031, and then again 6 months later when funding of $1.825 billion was marked for the expansion of housing infrastructure, I thought, wow, this is exactly what is needed. So I was supportive of these initiatives. But you know, even then, this support came with a cautionary sense of foreboding, a caveat, if you will, which has only become more clear to me in the intervening time. Yes, we need to stay focused on building more homes faster. But to do that well, we really need to address the systemic issues that stand in the way of that goal. Think about this. Since those announcements, residential site plan applications across the province have actually gone down instead of going up. They've tanked, in fact, from approximately 1,100 in 2022 to just over 500 a year later. And now, as we approach the end of 2024, we see that building permit applications have decreased as well, by an average across the province of about 40%. This is a huge problem. We need more housing, not less, and yet less housing is being generated. The tangible effect of this situation is not only that house prices remain too high, or that the percentage of household income going towards shelter is creating economic hardship for many people. It's also, more importantly perhaps, that increasing numbers of people are living on the edge with an extremely high degree of stress because their living arrangements are so very tenuous, so very insecure. You know, I have a 24-year-old daughter who graduated with honors from Trent University last year. She is smart, hardworking, committed to excellence in her field, and she lives at home with mom and dad because she is unable to afford living on her own. Now, she's not complaining really, and neither am I. She's one of the lucky ones. But there are thousands of others like her who may not be in a good situation, who really need housing stability in order to move forward in other areas of their lives. I also regularly meet people who are stressed by the prospect of defaulting on their mortgages, if only because they have no margin for emergencies, no margin for error, who live paycheck to paycheck and who sometimes only manage to make ends meet by renting out rooms in their home to boarders. And there are still others who are homeless, who are living in tent encampments all across the province, including in small towns, in large part because housing is so expensive. They can't even begin to imagine how they could afford what should be a basic human right. I recently spoke with a mother of 2 young children who works as a supply teacher, traveling every day up to 60 kilometers in various directions to schools across 2 counties. She is a hard worker and is doing what it takes to support her family. So kudos to her for that. But when I first met her, she had just received notification from her landlord that her rent was going to increase from $2,200 to $2,400 per month. That's an extra $2,400 per year. And at $2,400 per month, she is spending $28,800 annually for a 700 square foot apartment. With that kind of an outlay, it's pretty hard for her to save for a down payment on a home. So she came to me looking for options. Would she be able to afford a tiny home, she asked. And if she were to do that, did I know where she might be able to put it? And what about financing? How does financing work on a tiny home? How much of a mortgage would she qualify for? We explored everything from buying a building lot to renting land from a friend or a family member to moving into a trailer park. She really wants to own her own home and is particularly enamored by the idea of a tiny home because she thinks that that's going to be more affordable. But you know, at the end of the day, no matter how you cut it, a new tiny home at 700 square feet, so the same size as her current apartment, if it is going to be built to the Ontario Building Code standards, is still going to be at least $400,000, assuming that you can buy the land at a reasonable price. That's a lot of money for for anyone, let alone someone who's on a single income. What I didn't tell her was that a third of that cost, so around $130,000 on $400,000, was going to be some form of government taxes or fees. It's this ever-increasing government burden that I would have you consider. You know, it's great that the government is doing some things to streamline the approval process for new homes. And you're putting money toward infrastructure. This is important. But please bear in mind that there is still a lot more work that needs to be done in these areas. You are just getting started if you're going to take seriously tackle the efficiency implications of our current regulatory environment around zoning, building codes, funding for municipalities, approvals for development, etc. Quite frankly, the system right now is unwieldy and cumbersome, and that needs to change. Ontario, through successive governments over decades actually, has built this massive bureaucracy of legislation and regulation that has become so burdensome that it is now paralyzing to builders, developers, and buyers alike. To put that in context, let me end with this story. A friend shared with me recently that his daughter and her family moved from Ontario to a small city in the southern US in Alabama. They bought a 1-acre building lot there for $25,000. Then they drew up some architectural plans. They filled out the application for a building permit, sent it into the city with the requisite fee, and waited. But here's the thing. They only had to wait 1 day, 24 hours. And the fee for the building permit was only $279 with no development charges. Now I know that we're talking the US here, US dollars, but still it's less than $400 Canadian, nowhere near the $30,000 to $60,000 that it would cost to do the same thing here. And when I mention $30,000 to $60,000, I'm just talking about the building permit with the development charges. Add to that the HST, as well as the cost for having to wait on this or that agency or department for approvals. Add to that locational factors that often presuppose costs for archaeological or environmental studies, etc. When layered together, one on top of the other, on top of the other, on top of the other, and so on, the regulations that we have around housing and residential development here in Ontario have become way too burdensome. And that burden has led to the crisis that we're in today. So please think about that and try to get some semblance of practical efficiency back into the system for building houses. Thank you.